navigating life above a 30,000-foot view. Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and joining me today is pilot Jeff Andrechyn. Jeff shares about navigating life by looking to another world. He encourages us to reflect on your own life and your stories and your desires, and to trust God in God's guidance as you journey through life.
He's such a beautiful father who stands on the peripheral and does all this stuff for us without ever even being noticed. But once in a while, you get this revelation of who is really the one that has been over your life.
Here's my conversation with Jeff Andrechyn. Well, joining me today is Jeff Andrechyn, and that last name might feel familiar to you. You might remember his wife, Dana, from episode 115. So, Jeff, welcome to the Parable Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've got to say, before we get started, I really enjoyed listening to your podcast from a few weeks ago about hope. I think did you do that in a church setting?
I did. Yeah. So I'm on our teaching team at our church home, and that was kind of our last message into the new year. So, yeah.
This is what was payday for me on that listening. And that was when you were talking about Simeon and Anna seeing the promise of Jesus that they were promised all along, and how God was working through senior citizens. And we talked a lot about that with our friends, because at 66 now, I'm sort of heading into that territory of senior citizen. I actually get the discounts now. And there is still a lot of promises to be unfolded. How do we live prepared to be surprised? How do we live with a sense of wonder, even as a senior citizen? And I think the thing that's beautiful, I could say this now, being 66, is that we get to see things to their maturity. And so you mentioned Dana, and I would like to just tell a quick little story that just kind of happened to us. But just to go back into Dana's story, and what she didn't really talk about was when she was growing up, her mom had gone through a number of divorces. And so she lived in that section of town where people were trying to get back up on their feet. You know, if you went to go visit Fairport, New York, you didn't go to where Dana was being raised. You didn't take people over there. Yeah. Good people, but they were trying to get back up on their feet. And so there was a lot of austerity in those years for her. And so just to fast forward the story, the truth of it is she was a diamond in the rough. And so when I got her, I kind of saw that. And so just on a recent level, something that just happened to us, Dana has always wanted to go to Napa. That's been her dream, right? You know, set the table, right? With the wine and everything. And for years, I'm not sure how am I going to get her to Napa? I don't really know. It just wasn't really high on my priority list. And I have this really strange job. I fly for a wealthy individual here in Charlottesville, Virginia. So it's a wealthy family, and we really fly all around the world. And so people ask me, well, are you able to take Dana with you? And I go, no. I can't even imagine asking the boss if I could take my wife with me. Yeah. Well, anyway, here comes a trip going to Napa. And so the boss was talking to the other pilot, and he says, well, what are you guys going to do? And so he says, well, Jeff's thinking about commercialing in his wife, Dana, to San Francisco, and then we're going to San Francisco, and then we're going to drive up to Napa. And so the boss says, why don't you just bring her with us? Put her on the airplane. And so here Dana gets this invitation now to get on a private jet and go to Napa. And so when we got there, we, instead of getting our usual Nissan or rental car or a Chevy, we wound up getting an Audi. And here we are at the Chop House in Napa in no time at all. And she gets to sit up there at altitude where she gets invited into the flight deck with us. And it was just a beautiful crossing. You know, when air traffic control points out an airliner coming right at you when you're at 40,000 feet and he's at 41,000 feet, it almost looks like they're coming right at you. And if they're laying a heavy contrail down, it's really quite a spectacular scene, even though we see it all the time. If you've never seen it, it's really something to see. And so she got up there, she hung out with us, and all of a sudden, here we are in Napa, and we go to this tasting room, and they line up 4 glasses of wine, and they're pairing it with these foods. And it's this beautiful room, and the sun is streaming in this window, and it lights her up. And it's just this ethereal moment, and it's like, there she is. in her glory. I mean, she passed through the Pines of Perrington in Fairport, but she's not from there. She's actually the daughter of a king. And there she is in her glory. And I'm sitting there looking at her, and I'm like, baby, just spread one of your wings. I think we can handle the glory of your life for just a moment, you know? And it was just such a beautiful picture of God loving her. And I was a minor player in it. I just took her there. I didn't really have anything to do with that. It was an invitation from God, and there she was. And it's so beautiful because life is so hard. There's so many things coming at us. We don't get to live in that kind of luxury all the time. But in that moment, there she was. It was so beautiful.
That is stunning. What a lovely picture and a moment to like cherish and remember. Sometimes in our life, we aren't going to see the fruition until later, you know?
Right.
And then also what you were saying is when you walked into that room, it reminded me of the poem that Dana shared. It's like, here is this bounty that is laid before us.
This is an amazing story. I didn't even have anybody to tell it to, but I'm a witness of it. You know, maybe that's the beautiful thing about being a husband is you're a witness to it. And one of the best teachings I was ever around was a guy came into our men's group and talked about the Proverbs 31 man. Okay, so you've got the Proverbs 31 woman. Well, who's the guy behind the scenes maybe providing the opportunity for that woman to become who she really is, her natural height in God? And I feel like that's more my job with Dana. I love to give her and create those opportunities for her to fully develop as a daughter of a king.
So you said Dana grew up in New York. So did you also grow up in New York? How did you guys end up connecting with each other?
So I had gotten a job for an airline called Empire Airlines. So I was flying for them, and Dana was a reservation agent. And that's how we met. We have kind of different stories about how we met, how it all went. But it was love at first sight for me. It really was. And if it wasn't for Dana, I'm not sure if I would really believe in true love. So we're 37 years into this. And I think what's really beautiful is 37 years, I still can't keep my hands off her, you know? You know, how does that happen? Thank God I'm even at 66, I'm still faster than her, so I can catch her in the house, you know. And I know where all of her hiding places are. But the fact that, you know, there's eternity in her. You know, and if you would have told me that at 20, hey, you're going to get married, you're going to be with this woman for the next 40 years, I would be like, how is that going to work out? But the truth is there's eternity in her. And you continue to uncover that. And I watch her grow, right? You know, the idea of being a senior citizen and seeing this to fruition and watching her grow. And it's beautiful. Who would have thought she would have been a poet, right? You know? And you should see some of those tables that she does set. So it's a lot of fun.
I can't wait to be at one of them someday. I'm super excited.
One of the cool things I did this summer for her was she read the Anne of Green Gables series and always wanted to go to Prince Edward's Island. And so we put the airplane in maintenance for 6 weeks. And so we bought an Airstream and we drove all the way up to Prince Edward's Island. And we went out onto those red cliffs where Anne of Green Gables would run. And again, it was the same thing. She's basking in the sunlight and she's on the cliffs and she's got this big smile. And it was a beautiful kind of bucket list thing to do.
Yeah.
And when you're my age at 66, if you have some bucket list things, you better start doing them, right? You know, do them now.
Yeah. Jeff, you said that obviously we talked a lot about you being a pilot. How did you get into piloting? Like, has that always been a dream for you?
One of my first memories is standing up in my dad's lap in a DC-6 crossing the ocean, and we were making pictures out of the clouds. So my dad was the captain for a non-SCAD at the time called Slick Airways, believe it or not. I grew up in the industry. And so it was a pretty easy choice for me to make that transition. I've always been there. And that is a little bit of my parable story.
Well, then why don't you go ahead and jump right in?
Okay, so when I was 11 and 12 years old, I was right at that 11 or 12 years old. It was 1969. My dad was flying for Slick Airways, and they were taking supplies into Vietnam. So they were flying supplies in, and they were flying bodies out. They were bringing our fallen soldiers home. And so in 69, over the summer, I'm out of school. Dad decides to bring the family to Vietnam with them. So we went up Alaska, Okinawa, and then Vietnam. And then we would return the same way. But we stayed in Okinawa for like a month. And he flew Saigon, Okinawa trips back and forth. And one of the interesting things on that journey was the constellation that we were in order to navigate, the navigator would go up and he would look up on this spyglass up on top of the airplane and he would look at the stars, and then he would come down and he would plot our course course over the Pacific by shooting the stars. And he would take me up, and I would look up through that glass into the stars, and it was amazing. And as a young man, to be able to watch a sunset over the Pacific with the crew in a constellation was probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. And then I would go in the back of the constellation, because I'm 11, 12 years old, and I'm running back there, and there's all the fallen soldiers back there. I was back there with our guys who were in coffins. And so at 11 years old, I feel like I was shown that we live in a beautiful world, that we live in a world at war, and that the way to navigate this world is to look to another world. And that story's been playing out all my life. I can go on and on, but that story is still playing itself out right now. Even some of the places that my boss wants to go to, I'm like, you want to go to the Galapagos? I don't even know where that is. I got to look at it on a map. We're going to some pretty challenging destinations. So this idea of how do we navigate this world with the idea of we have to look to another world, that our life comes from above.
I can't even imagine, at 11, just experiencing that.
Yeah.
We have a son that's almost 11 next month. And so just to think, to understand the reality of what is happening. I mean, at time, I'm sure in 1969, it was a very fearful time too. There was this uncertainty.
We were unhinged in 1969 because obviously Kennedy had been shot. Now Martin Luther King in 68, RFK in, I think it was 68. And wives were turning to their husbands and going, is this nation falling apart? It was a deep winter, even though it was summer. Mm-hmm. It was a very, very difficult period in our history because obviously now we have all the riots going on. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, there were riots going on in Newark, 12 miles from where I was living in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And so everybody was asking my dad, my gosh, you took your family to Vietnam over the summer? And my dad's like, well, it was either that or leave them in Newark. And with the riots, I think it was safer to be in Vietnam than it was in Newark, because the race riots were going on. So it was a crazy time. But one of the most beautiful things happened in 1969 to turn that around. Mm-hmm. And that was the Apollo moon landing. And oh my gosh, it was a really, really difficult time in our history.
So at that time in your life, at 11, looking up to the sky, did you have a relationship with Jesus at that point? Was that a part of your life or did that come later?
Oh, that came actually much later. So that really didn't happen for another 11 years or so. But I think there was something really that God is working back then.
Yeah. Just
as much as he was after I came to the realization of who Jesus Christ was. So he's very, very much in my story. As I looked up and the navigator took me down to plot our course over the Pacific, even though we were in this metal tube miles above the ocean, I really felt Dad. I felt the presence of my dad, like my dad knew what he was doing. And as I looked up into the stars, what I couldn't see was obviously there was another father who was sitting there in the wings, and I was learning about him through my own dad, my own adventurous dad. The Jesus that I know is very, very adventurous. The course that he plotted for my life was a lot more dangerous than the one I would have plotted for my own life. And so I was learning very much about God, even though I was 11 years old. And that I can recover by looking back. I think it's really important for us to take a look back into our stories. So if I could pass anything on to the listeners, I just want to talk about, well, how do you navigate this world by looking to another world? How do we navigate our stories? How do we go forward? And I had the pleasure of working with Gary Barklow from the Noble Heart. And we would do calling retreats together to help men find their place in the journey. And we used story, desire, and journey to help orient you to where you are in the story right now. And so story is very important. So if Jay Leno takes a mic and he goes out on the sidewalk and he says to people, hey, who fought in the Civil War? And there's crickets, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, when was the War of 1812? And people, right? And it's kind of funny, and we all get it. But the reality of it is my heart breaks because these people don't know the story they're living in. And when we think about evil, we often think of murder. We go back to Hitler, Stalin. What if evil was you not knowing the story you're living in? What if that was really evil? You didn't really know who you were or who God was. And so I have a tendency to look at story as incredibly important. So it is very, very important to go back into your story. One of the things that we like to work with is desire. We have to sometimes go back into a person's story to uncover what their desires were or are. So often, those desires show up when we're 10, 11, 12 years old, but they get buried in life as we go through and we do the college years, we get married, we have kids, we have the job, and those things that we used to love to do are sometimes buried. They're irrevocable. We have them, but they're not in the forefront. And so we have to go back and look at what our desires are in order to move forward. The best thing about your life is that the thing you're supposed to do next is the thing you most want to do, actually, right? Mm. And so I'm going to give you a perfect example of how that worked out in my life and how I navigated. So during COVID, they were shutting down the airlines. So I'm a captain at American Airlines. Mm-hmm. And they're going to offer 60% pay, full benefits if you would take an early out. And they wanted guys that were 64 first. And if they couldn't get 64-year-olds, they'd go to 63. And last resort, they'd go to 62. Mm-hmm. Well, I was 62 in 2 months. And I'm looking at this opportunity to punch out of American Airlines and do what I've always wanted to do. And that was, of course, to buy an Airstream and travel the country with data and go to these national parks. And so the problem was I was finally killing it financially. I was finally making enough money where my retirement wouldn't look embarrassing. And so I'm going to have to give that up in order to pursue this dream of just getting in this metal. Dana says I have a thing for metal tubes, I'm going to get in this metal tube and take my wife to national parks around the country, right? And so, I've got a week to think about this, right? I'm really debating. I am asking God, and I hear as clear as can be from God, I am not going to let you make a mistake. And I'm like, really? Then I can just do what I want to do? I'm out of here. Boom. I hit that button. I punched out of American Airlines and they took it. They took 616 guys. I was number 559 processed. And man, I was in the national parks in 2 months from there. And 2020 and 2021 wound up being some of the best years of our lives. Yeah. Just me and Dana in that Airstream cruising the country. And so it's just a picture of desire, that our desires are given to us by those good desires. We know what the evil desires are. We're not talking about them. We're talking about those good desires that help navigate us through this world. And then the other part is this idea of journey, that we are in fact being led from above. We're amphibians. We walk on this earth, and yet we can navigate into another world. And that world is the kingdom. And so this idea that we need to be plugged into that in order to navigate this world. And it's not a matter of, hey, how do I figure out the formula for this life from above? Do I add a pinch of Ephesians and a dash of Colossians and throw in a slice of the Gospel of Luke in order to figure out this formula about how to navigate from above? And I would say the best way to do it is not to come up with some formula, but to actually trust that you are being led by God. Mm-hmm. He is leading you right now. And some of the most difficult things for us to understand is that He is not afraid to bring you into very challenging environments where you're challenged to grow. That's where I love to come in and help people in very challenging situations to help them understand this could actually be God taking you through the valley of the shadow of death right now, because you're going to unload some things that you need to unload to go further in your journey. And so journey becomes a very important part of this whole thing. So that's kind of my parable in 15 minutes.
That's beautiful, Jeff. I love for you, as you were going through those steps, I'm going to ask each one. I have a question for each one of those. For the part where it can be like the evil one is just kind of like letting us forget about our story, when would you say that for you, kind of you were first trying to figure that out for yourself?
Yeah, that's an unfolding reality, because when I look at those people who are asked the question, who fought in the Civil War and they don't know, there are parts of my story that I am still very much uncovering. Even right now, I am still in the process of learning the story that I'm living in. And so those revelations have come in God's timing when He wants to reveal something new for me, right? So I'll give you an example. I was actually out of work for 8 years when I was 45 to 53, right in there. So I was out on medical from the airlines. Long story short, I got back. And so I had been out for 8 years, but now I have to go full on right into the simulator and pass a check ride to be an airline pilot again. And if you're out of an industry for more than 2 years, that industry will pass you by. So I had a lot of catch-up work to do, but actually I got in the simulator and I picked it up like I had never left. And so the day I was going to take a check ride, I went for a walk. And I'm going to call my dad, who is an airline pilot, and I'm going to say, hey, Dad, thank you for making me a stick and rudder man. Thank you for making me the pilot that I am. So I'm going to affirm my dad. And as I'm walking, I hear the Lord go, so who made you a stick and rudder man? And I'm like, you mean that was you all along? You know, he's such a beautiful father who stands on the peripheral and does all this stuff for us without ever even being noticed. But once in a while, you get this revelation of who is really the one that has been over your life. And so I would look at this as a continual, there was never I fully have my story, I fully understand my story moment. There were just series of events that took place where God opened up. And as he does, I think there's more trust that develops.
Yeah. One, I believe there's more trust. And also, like, we're not even ready to know that specific amount of information yet.
Exactly.
It's just an awakening, or maybe you need a certain maturity either in your faith or just your life in general to understand, oh, yes, I get that now. Because maybe beforehand, he knows that you weren't prepared to do that.
Right. And so I'm still learning. I just read a book about World War II and what was going on in the Ukraine. And somebody got my grandfather a ticket out of the Ukraine in 1917, right as the Bolsheviks were taking over. And so my story begins with an exodus from the Ukraine that was going to turn into a bloodbath through World War I and World War II. And so I'm still recovering my own story as I go along.
You know, you talked about desire, Jeff, and as for someone who said you're almost getting into that elderly generation, you know, what is that current desire for you right now? Where do you see God pivoting you and leading you in that?
That is a great question because it really kind of goes along with your talk about hope, which really kind of put me on like a 2-week little journey about, okay, let's bury down into that. And here's where I am with that question right now. First of all, I did mention the term Exodus. You know, there's this idea of, okay, I've walked through this earth, but this journey is now leading me home. And I just want to continue to walk out of those things that hinder you and weigh you down and spend a little bit more time with God looking up and beholding where I'm going to. I just want to get to a point, and my greatest hope is that I could be a person who is helping other people. I'm ready to retire. I talk to Dana all the time, and I'm going, okay, this has been fun, but I am just ready to just let go, and I just want to be there for other people. Those are my two desires, an exodus and an ability to help other people. But I don't want to just help just to help. I want to help according to my calling and where I could be the most effective.
As a pilot, you get a perspective that most people don't get to have in their life. Just like seeing the clouds. I mean, I only get to see that when I'm watching Maverick. Okay. But, you know, when you were talking about that connection to above, how do you feel like within this last couple of years, your relationship with God has changed, your journey has changed, and what has been maybe some of the most helpful tools or practices that you found currently for yourself?
It does give you a wonderful perspective, and it is a privilege to have that perspective. So for those years flying with American, I would go down to the Caribbean quite a bit, and there were water routes that you didn't have to be in constant contact with air traffic control. And so that you would have a good hour where you didn't have to monitor the radios. And I'd always look at the co-pilot and I'd go, you got the radios. And I put my headset on and I had this epic soundtrack music I would listen to. And I'm looking at the stars. I'm looking at Jupiter. I'm looking at Betelgeuse, right? And it's a wonderful place for me to worship. And so I've not had the ability to have seminar classroom training. All my training has been on the road with God.
Yeah.
I love the idea that God said to Abraham, hey, get out of your father's house, leave everything that's been comfortable for you, and let's go on a journey. And he didn't have that classroom training. His classroom training was the journey itself, where it was life and death. And that just seems to be the place where I learn the most. And that's the place where I worship. It's just easier for me to worship at 41,000 feet under the stars than in a building. And that's just me.
That's super helpful. I say this all the time, is that the way that our brain works, we all have different learning styles. And we also, I think that changes over time as well. And I think our relationship with God can be so different from the next person.
Right.
And he meets us where we're at. Your seminar levels, we're at next to Jupiter. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah. But the point being is this idea of getting into beauty, and everybody has that opportunity, and everybody knows where that place is for them, whether it be at the beach, up in the mountains. Yeah. And this is one of the things I've learned is that I need that almost on a daily basis. Yeah. I need to get myself in the way of beauty. And so we live right at the base of Skyline Drive, and I'll disappear for 2 or 3 hours with the dog. And Dana goes, where did you go? I went hiking. I need to get up there. I need to get at elevation and take a 20,000 foot look, because life can be very, very difficult. Yeah. The beauty, I think, is really important.
As you're heading into retirement, and that's something that eventually everybody kind of gets to that age. What's something that you would encourage people to be mindful of as you get to retirement, and something maybe you didn't expect?
My hope is that, again, they might be some of your best years ever, actually. And so I think what you have to be mindful of is kind of going back and recovering some things that you weren't able to do because you were raising a family, you were providing, you were in a job, whatever it is. I heard a woman say something really interesting. She said, when I got married, so I'm talking to women here. This is a large part of your audience. And I almost feel like, that show Outnumbered, the TV show Outnumbered. I almost feel like the guy in Outnumbered, which I always wanted to be. I always wanted to be that one guy with 4 women around me. I'm going to take you on here with social issues. But the truth is, I can't even take on Dana by myself. So, but she said something really interesting. She said, when I got married, I lost my last name. And when I had a child, I lost my first name. I became mom, right? And that's really interesting, because this idea of going back and recovering those desires and what it is that you really love to do is a journey in and of itself. And so as you're approaching those years where you're getting ready to retire, I think it's really important to go back into your story. Yeah. And you don't even want to do that by yourself. You want to go there with a few people who understand this idea and maybe can help you and ask you the right questions to recovering where are those desires. Mm-hmm. I think when a person truly lives out of the desires of their heart, you see the glory of God in their lives. That's where you reflect his image the most. If God is the Father of glory, he didn't mind giving some of that glory to his kids, Yeah. I would say take a deep dive back into your own story and go into these years with the belief that they could be the best years in your life, possibly.
Any challenges you feel coming up, or it could be internally or externally?
I will say right now at 66, it hasn't gotten easier. What's challenging is my dad, who's 98, and his wife, who is 85. They live with us, and so we're kind of walking my dad home right now. Mm-hmm. And you lose them mentally a little bit each and every month, it seems like, and so that's really challenging. When you fly for a billionaire, that's a very demanding job. And I'm married. That's pretty demanding. And my son, who went through a horrible divorce, I don't know if any of them are good, is home and is a wreck. Right. Mm-hmm. So we have all these dynamics going on in our house. And so it's actually a very challenging. So I need God as much now at 66 as I did when I was 40 in the midst of raising kids and trying to work and that sort of thing. So it's a very challenging stage.
Well, I mean, that just connects back when you said you were 11 in that plane, you looked out and you saw a beautiful world, but in the back, there were bodies. Like, there is challenge.
Right.
So we have to hold that tension of our lives of we can have great joy while challenges are still there. And within the midst of it is our Father above. So, so good.
Yeah. And that was the message. People are going to die around you. We live in a world at war, and just look at what's going on. Just watch the news.
Sometimes I don't want to. Okay.
Yeah, I know. Me too. Rather grow up on Skyline Drive.
Yes. Jeff, I wanted to circle back because in the beginning you had said when you were talking about Dana, that you never thought something to the effect of like, you never were going to understand or know true love. Could you just explain what you meant by that? I'm just very curious.
I grew up in the 70s, and it was the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era. And I was not a Christian. So there were the girls, and so there were a number of relationships that you had. And so I just thought it was always going to be like that. But when I met Dana and fell in love, that feeling of true love didn't happen right away. I was just, obviously, you fall in lust right away. Yeah. But I think it was something that developed. There was something in the staying power of being with her. But I think the most important thing was this idea of we came to faith together, and eternity enters you, and that you begin to grow together. I think the growing process together is what solidified the true love aspect. And I think what was important in us coming to faith together was that when the struggles and the battles came against us, we turned our swords outward and were back to back. We supported one another and actually grew stronger through the trials that we endured. And all the things, obviously, we talked about the world at war. People are going to die around you. And I say that metaphorically, too. There's just a lot of battles. And so we grew stronger through those together. So I think that idea in me of true love grew. It wouldn't be something I would have known when I was 28 years old and I met Dana.
Well, Jeff, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. All of Jeff's contact information will be available in today's show notes. So, Jeff Andrechyn, thanks for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you for what you do. I love the idea of you opening up story because we're just not really that good at that in church. God bless church, but we're looking forward and we're kind of focused on that one person, and we're not really understanding our story or the people around us. And so you opening up story like this is a blessing. And I hope as I've told my story, God is talking to your listeners about their own story.
I'm so grateful for Jeff and his encouragement to me about the message I shared on hope. I will put that in today's show notes. I think many of us do things or say things and we don't think it's going to take effect or it's going to go in any place, but God does use all of it. And he is so good at that. And so I'm thankful for that reminder for myself. To connect with Jeff, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time together today. Number 1, what if the evil part of life is that you don't know the story that you're living in today? I'm going to pray, and I hope that you pray that God reveals a portion of that to you to work through that. Number 2, how can you get yourself in the way of beauty? For me, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is food and thinking about flavor when people love it. I saw my daughter the other night. She was just like shoving this food into her mouth because she thought it was so good. And God is in all of those things in our life. So how can you get yourself in the way of beauty? How can you see God reflected in so many pieces of our life? One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing it with a friend. If you could pass that along today, that really helps people find out about these amazing parable stories. And a huge thanks to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for his stellar editing skills. That is going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God is providing beauty all around. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.